Welcome out to session number 49, June the 4th, 2024. Just a couple of brief political notes, because a few people have told me recently that they kind of like when I say a few things that ties it into current events. And it's just interesting to me over the last month or two, the increasing pressure on Israel, not only in the face of what happened on October the 7th, but every day Hezbollah and others are firing rockets and bombs into their country. And I'm thinking, about how many minutes would the United States take that from a foreign country before we send our jet planes to put a stop to it and gathered our troops? And yet, for some reason, Israel is painted as the offender and as the aggressor. And they're even calling for a regime change. They want our administration tries to veil it somewhat, but it's obvious that they really dislike Netanyahu. They want him gone. But I also find it interesting, almost every week, seems like every several days, a new proposal is put forth in the United Nations, or some country gathers some of the leaders, tries to put a new proposal on the table. And they kind of know when they're doing it that this really isn't the solution. It's almost like they're flailing around, trying to find how to get out of this thing. And it's really helping us understand why the Antichrist will be received so well, because the greatest minds in the world right now, military and political, pretty much has to admit they really don't know the best way to get out of this right now. And I have found it interesting, the latest proposal, because most of them have a name attached to them, either the country that proposes it or some kind of description about peace or something about the Middle East. And this latest proposal that's applying the most pressure ever on Israel to accept it, I noticed all the news outlets are calling it by the same name, the Biden proposal. And we know it didn't come from him. And I got thinking, why did they decide to attach this one with the name of our president right now? I don't know for sure. But I have a feeling, since his poll numbers are so poor, and it's so obvious that he doesn't have what it takes, yet evidently he still wants to run again, and it's looking pretty negative about him. The worse they try to hurt Trump, the higher his poll numbers go. It's just an interesting time to live right now. And so we may well elect a man that between now and the election, you will hear 10,000 million times convicted felon attached to his name. All the news outlets, every time they bring up his name, they will use convicted felon in front of his name. You get so sick of hearing that. And they really think they have the power to destroy him in the eyes of enough people, particularly soccer moms, I think, women that just don't want that hassle of his style and all the trouble that seems to come with him. We don't want that anymore. So I'll vote for the other guy. Don't know if it'll work or not. But my working theory is that what they are calling the Biden proposal They will put so much pressure on Israel that in some form they will at least temporarily accept it, so that before the election, so that President Biden will be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in order to save his election. It's like it's being set up. It's like you can just kind of see it unfolding in that direction. I could be way off base, but it seems like that might be the only chance he has. If he can win a Nobel Peace Prize, he may be able to pull it out. I don't know, but as I've said all along, this is going to be a crazy year, and I think the more it looks like he may not be able to pull out a victory, and the convicted felon might win the election, all bets are off. They'll pull out all stops. So it's going to be real interesting next several months. So this session tonight is the mystery of godliness in the book of Revelation. Last week was the mystery of iniquity in the book of Revelation. And I want to give credit to the Lord, because all the many times I've taught and studied the book of Revelation, I've never approached it this exact way. That it's the mystery of iniquity, the mystery of godliness, on a collision course all the way through. And all the way through, last session, we dealt with the major players on the mystery of iniquity. And I have them written down here in the end of that first big paragraph. The mystery of iniquity has its major players: Satan, Antichrist, the false prophet. All three of them are mentioned in 1613. And the system they operate through, Mystery Babylon, and all that it represents. The mystery of godliness has its major players: the Father, and in Revelation 1:1, even though it starts out by saying the revelation of Jesus Christ, so it's about him and it's from him, but it goes on to say, which God gave him to show his servants. Now, God is a generic name. We know it's Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, but often when the generic name God is used in the same verse that also mentions Jesus Christ, then we normally make God there the Father. And he's giving to his Son to pass on to his servants. So we have the Father and the Son in the first verse, and then especially in chapters 2 and 3, to each of the seven churches, each one ends, for instance, in 2:7, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So all three persons of the Trinity are mentioned right away and all the way through the book, and the system they operate through, which is the church, and which is also the city of the great king from Psalm 48:2, Jerusalem, and all that it represents. So I've never approached Revelation simply focused on these two terms, the mystery of iniquity, the mystery of godliness. The interesting thing about those two terms, each of them are only used once in the whole Bible. I got to thinking about that. Why? Normally we will say the more often a term is used shows God is putting an emphasis on that, wants us to really pay attention. But the opposite almost works in this case. By using it so sparingly is how he puts the emphasis on it. Because what better way is there to capture these two sets of beings and their plans and how they operate in the world and in creation, what their ultimate goals are? What better terms could we come up with than the mystery of iniquity and the mystery of godliness? Yet by using those only once, it almost puts a greater emphasis on it. So the mystery of godliness is 1 Timothy 3:16. I would like to read that because it's a beautiful verse. Without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. Then it goes on to describe what the mystery of godliness is. And what it goes on to describe is basically what we would call the incarnation of Christ. How that God became a human being and what he accomplished by doing that. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up in glory. That's a good outline of the coming of Christ in the flesh, what he accomplished, then he went back to his Father in glory. So the incarnation is something we believe that, but we don't understand. And the thing about the incarnation from this verse is that he has an eternal body. We don't think of God as having a uh, a body of any type, something you can see and touch. But Jesus took that on, and he took that on for eternity, where the Father and the Spirit, of course, remain as spirits. So the whole book of Revelation starts out the revelation of Jesus Christ. And I say in the middle of that first paragraph, the book of Revelation has a lot in it about the evil of the mystery of iniquity. But the great thing about how this book is laid out, it begins and ends with the beauty and wonder of the mystery of godliness. So it puts that mystery of iniquity kind of like in the middle, let's say 1/3. And then the first 1/3 and the last, at least several chapters, are more about the mystery of godliness. Second paragraph, the transition from the present evil age into the glorious kingdom age is called the day of the Lord. That's a really important term in the Bible, phrase. And I make that to be the seventh day Sabbath rest called the millennium. That's the day of the Lord is what kicks that off, and you could almost call the entire 1,000 years the day of the Lord, because he will be the center focus. We could also say the day of the Lord is when the mystery of iniquity is defeated, which would be the crushed head of Genesis 3:15. And the mystery of godliness then dominates everyday life. It will be a beautiful time of great blessing for redeemed creation. We call it the millennial, meaning 1,000 years. And that particular term is used 6 times in Revelation 20. If you want to find out real quick what somebody believes about, are they premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial? There's large different ways of looking at. All of these huge systems are connected with the millennium. What do you believe about the millennium? Is it literal? Does Christ come back before the millennial, premillennial, and he's the one who directly and actively sets it up and rules for 1,000 years? That's premillennial. Postmillennial would mean, and it's a strong belief, believe it or not, that eventually the gospel is going to conquer enough of the world that a millennial age will be ushered in. And then at the end of that, Jesus will return. And that has like a single general resurrection and judgment and everything. Amillennial does not see the 1,000 years as literal. They say it's a large round number. It's symbolic. Revelation is a very symbolic book. It's representative of the entire church age. We are in the millennium. So if you want to find out real quick, just ask someone, what do you believe about the millennium? And you'll find out real quick. And then that's how they see the whole Bible. Interesting, those 6 times in Revelation 20 that 1,000 years is mentioned, 3 of them are mentioned in connection to Satan. He's bound 1,000 years. He won't be loosed till 1,000 years are up. At the end of the 1,000 years, he'll be loosed for a little season. So those three are about him. But the other three are about the saints who come through the tribulation. Blessed are those of the first resurrection. They shall rule and reign with Christ 1,000 years. They did not take the mark of the beast. They were beheaded for their testimony. They'll rule and reign with him 1,000 years. So that idea is mentioned 3 times. That's just kind of interesting how it's divided 3 and 3 like that. So the book of Revelation opens with a detailed and elaborate description of this person that Paul speaks of in 1 Timothy 3:16, the mystery of godliness. So whatever the mystery of godliness, whatever godliness means in the mystery of godliness, Jesus was the full expression of it in every way. Whatever you think of when you think of godliness, he's the perfect example of what it means. We pray to be godly. We desire to be godly. We're supposed to walk godly in this present evil age, but we fall short of godliness in its fullness. Jesus was godliness in its fullness. But before this description in 1:3, and this is really important, anytime you study the book of Revelation, 1:3 is a really important verse. Blessed is he who reads, those who hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. So there's progression. There's a value in reading it. There's a value in hearing others talk about it. But the real value is keeping those things that are written. We normally don't think of the book of Revelation as a practical Christian life book. But this verse says it is. That there are things written in this particular book that we can keep in our daily lives. A great blessing is promised to those who follow and love this person of 1:1. And then in chapter 1, starting in verse 9 and 10, and I don't have the words to describe this. We all know what these verses say, this beautiful description of Christ. But when it says in verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet, saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, and what you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches, and it names them. Verse 12, then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands or candlesticks. Isn't that interesting? There's a lot to be said about this deep connection between Christ and his churches. The first thing he sees is the candlesticks. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like the Son of Man. And it goes on to give this beautiful description. John sees his dear friend again. He hadn't seen him for 60 years or so. John was a young man when Jesus ascended. Now he's an old man on the Isle of Patmos. And he sees him again. I just can't imagine the emotions. And he sees him in all of his glory. He sees him evidently at least equal to, maybe even greater than, he saw him on the Mount of Transfiguration. John got to see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating great drops of blood. He got to see Jesus hanging on the cross. He was standing there next to Mary. Jesus told him, I want you to take care of her. He saw Jesus when he ascended. He saw Jesus right after he resurrected. He saw Jesus in many different settings and ways of describing him. But how he sees him here is almost beyond description. It's almost impossible. I mean, he's using very elaborate, descriptive, dramatic, almost hyperbolic language Why would you talk about someone as his head and hair was white like wool, his eyes like a flame of fire, his feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace. His voice is the sound of many waters. But it is important to point out that God wanted John to see Jesus in the midst of his churches. I heard a man say today, there's an increasing antagonism in Christianity about churches. And I know churches, there's a lot about churches to criticize because they're made up of humans like me. So there is a lot to criticize. But the thing I'm hearing more, which tells me these people have a wrong view of the Lord's church. The man said today, we need to get Christ away from his church, away from the churches. Now I can't read his heart. Evidently, he was trying to say something like, there's not enough Christ in the churches, and people are worshiping the churches rather than Christ, or something. I don't know what he was trying to say. But this idea of we need to separate Christ from churches and just serve Christ and forget about the churches. They're a waste of time and energy. And, there's a lot of scandals. There's a lot of harmful kinds of churches that call themselves churches that are not. I understand all of that. But isn't it interesting? God made sure what John saw was Christ among his churches. Not just Christ out here separate, among them. And that's the way he wants it to be. And that's the way churches should want to be, Christ among them. So I just find it so interesting that that's how the vision begins with the candlesticks, the lampstands, and then Christ walking among them. Most of you know this. You've heard this. You know this from your own readings. Each letter to the 7 churches begins with a description of Christ that is particular to that church, what they needed to see and know about him, and what we need as well. So I give the verses. You've all taught, read, heard this many times, but these are wonderful descriptions. 2:1, these things says he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. So again, this emphasis of yes, I am Jesus Christ. You must have a personal relationship with me, but in your life of service to me, I want it to be connected with what I'm showing here. The candlesticks, the stars. It needs to be involved in this kind of thing, not just out there on your own. And I'm really seeing this more and more, people recommending you just kind of be on your own, not be connected to a church. 2:8, these things says the first and the last, who was dead, came to life. 2:12, these things says he who has the sharp two-edged sword. 2:18, these things says the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and his feet like fine brass. 3:1, these things says he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. 3:7, these things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. And then finally in 3:14, these things says the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. Then we come into chapter 4 and 5. Chapter 4 is very much like the first few chapters of Ezekiel, the throne room of God. People read over there in Ezekiel the first few chapters and they try to say it's describing spaceships and creatures in outer space and all that, but it's describing the throne room of God. And John is rewording Ezekiel in chapter 4. And it's an awesome scene. But what it's building toward is chapter 5. Chapter 4 is building toward chapter 5 about Christ being able to open the seven sealed book. As I say, I always like to bring this out when I'm talking about Revelation. He's revealed in chapter 5 in verse 5. One of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its seven seals." We normally look at Christ in the book of Revelation, and I've probably said it, I've heard many others say it, that in his first coming, he came like a lamb. In his second coming, he comes like a lion. And that grabs hold of, I think, big truth that there's a lot of good to say it that way. But it is interesting in Revelation, he's really only called the lion one time. And he's called the lamb 27 times. It's almost as if, again, calling him the lion one time almost adds emphasis to it by its rarity. But the emphasis is he can only be the lion because he was the lamb. And if he was not the lamb, he cannot be the lion. So I've seen these religious T-shirts. I almost bought one myself recently because I really like the picture of it. It shows a picture of a lamb and a lion next to each other. And it's, speaking about this idea of Christ being both the lion and the lamb. Because it says in verse 6, "I looked, and behold, in the midst of the throne, the four living creatures, in the midst of the elders stood a lamb, as though it had been slain." What does that mean? So, okay, he's the lion in one verse. And so you picture this lion big and strong and roaring and just, king of the beasts. But when he sees him as a lamb, why does it describe him as though it had been slain? So that's even as late as the second coming of Christ and all of the events leading up to it, God still wants us to have this image of a slain lamb. So, but I'm trying to picture what John would have seen. What does it mean, a lamb as though it had been slain? Was it bloody? Was it messed up? Was it? I don't know. You think in this scene it would be a lamb just kind of laying there meek and gentle. But evidently God wanted John to notice, because one of the last things John had seen of Jesus before Jesus ascended was a lamb slain. So God wanted to bring that back to his mind. Next paragraph, "Even the seals, trumpets, and bowls of wrath are manifestations of the mystery of godliness. They are his way of defeating his enemies, preparing the way to set up his glorious kingdom, removing pride and replacing it with humble faith and love as dominant qualities on earth." Can you imagine what it's going to be like when pride is removed? Arrogance and pride and loftiness and humility will be the dominant quality. Love will also, and that every operation on earth will be guided by like the fruit of the spirit qualities, not the works of the flesh qualities like they are today. So the works of the flesh will be very much suppressed. It won't be eliminated, but it's going to be in the minority. The fruit of the spirit is going to be in control for 1,000 years. Just think how prosperous the world will be. The great debate now in man's pride is to be found in AI that everyone's talking about now. And most of the economists are saying that in the next 10 years, AI will take over so many jobs that unemployment will be sky high. Some say like 50%. And so that's why they're pushing for universal basic income. Because if half the workforce has no jobs, how are they going to live? So you got to like guarantee them a certain wage. They're talking about what that's going to do to the economies and how everything's going to have to change drastically. But then people like Elon Musk, this so interesting man, he says, no, just the opposite. He said, with AI taking over, and as they learn and grow in what they're doing, that production of everything in the world will be multiplied hundreds of times over from what humans are able to do now, so that it will be a golden age, just the opposite of what most of the economists are saying. So, okay, which extreme is it going to be? And most all of them say it's going to be within the next 10 years. So evidently most of we're all going to find out. But that is man in his pride saying, we have the solution to all the world's problems. But true prosperity is going to come along when human pride is going to be eliminated and humility and love is going to dominate. And I've kind of gone off on these tangents through the years. I don't know exactly what it will be like, but I just like for people to use their imagination. What will it be like with Jesus and his bride in glorified bodies with perfect use of their brains, supervising the affairs of the earth? What will that do to medicine? How advanced will medicine become overnight to where the worst disease possible will have an immediate solution? What will it do to production of crops if people with perfect minds are able to advise farmers on how to grow their crops? There's a verse in the Old Testament that says during the millennial, the reapers will surpass the sowers. It's going to be so productive that they're not going to be able to keep up with being able to harvest the amount of food. What will it do to science? You just take every field of study, and it will multiply hundreds of times beyond what it is now. What will life be like, even for those who at the end have not believed and not given allegiance to Christ, and they're going to be doomed? You think, why? Even their life is going to be so much better. They're going to get to participate in the abundance of the earth because of the government that knows exactly the answers to all the problems that may come up. Chapters 11 through 13 focus on his arch enemy, setting the stage for the showdown. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 5, with his people in deep love and devotion to him and to each other. That's that famous passage about he's on Mount Zion with the 144,000, having his father's name written on their foreheads. There's this interesting contrast all through Revelation. In fact, the idea of a mark on the forehead of the saints and his name on their forehead, that kind of idea is mentioned several times more often than the mark of the beast. But, most of the emphasis is always on the mark of the beast. But the mark of God on the saints is just as prominent, or even more so, and for us, more important. But in verse 4 of chapter 14, these are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. So that's some of the symbolic spiritual language of Revelation. Paul said, I present you as a chaste virgin to Christ, to the Corinthians. So this is picking up on that same idea. They're the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. I don't follow the Lamb wherever he goes right now. This kind of folds into many of the changes I've made in my understanding of the time of the tribulation and what the saints will be like. Great tribulation will bring great grace. And so when chapter 12 and verse 11 says that they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death, I take it to mean just that the grace will be so abundant for those who refuse the mark, those who make it clear their allegiance is with Christ. Many of them will be killed, according to 13:7. He's going to be in the process of overcoming them. But even in that, when it says they will not love their lives to the death, what does it really mean for a person not to love their life to the death? That means perfect love for Christ will cast out fear. It means the courage and the boldness will be there. I'm going to get into that a little bit more next session about overcomers. But what does it mean in 14 and 4? What does it really mean? They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. I think that might be the best description of what the saints will be given the grace to do in the tribulation. They will literally follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And then, of course, 19:11 through 16 is one of the most dramatic pictures of Christ in the Bible as conquering king. And I added this one sentence. I don't really want to dwell on it too much, but I think one way of looking at the entire book of Revelation is this sentence at the end of that paragraph. The natural world will be invaded with the supernatural, both good and bad. There's a lot of spirit activity, both good and bad, in Revelation. God's going to allow the supernatural world to basically overwhelm the natural world. And the natural world, for the most part, won't be able to handle it. The high point of the mystery of godliness in the last 7 years is the sounding of the seventh trumpet. Revelation 10:7, the mystery of God should be finished. That's that Greek word telos. The high point of the mystery of iniquity is the abomination of desolation. 2 Thessalonians 2:4. When he goes into the temple, declares himself as God. That's his high point. That's when he demands allegiance. That's when the mark of the beast is set up. That's when he's at his death and resurrection event. That's when Satan incarnates him. That's when he's at his high point. And then the seventh trumpet, of course, is the high point for the mystery of godliness. The Antichrist throws down the gauntlet at God in this defiant act, the abomination of desolation. God picks up the gauntlet and for 3.5 years shows him who is really in charge, climaxing in that white horse heaven open scene in Revelation 19, that sharp sword going out of his mouth. Then light and love and peace and joy and spiritual understanding will prevail and dominate. 1,000-year Bible study with Christ as the great rabbi, revealing so much in his word that we missed or had wrong. The ultimate expression of the mystery of godliness is the extension of his own resurrection, the resurrection of his saints, embodied like unto his. Then the two verses that speak about that. Revelation 20 mentions very little about the details of the millennial Sabbath rest. I used to always wonder about that. We believe in the millennial. We believe that 1,000 years is going to be uh, so directly uh, guided by Christ and his bride. What a wonderful time it will be. And yet, Revelation 20 doesn't give any details about it. And I've concluded it's because he had already directed so many of his Old Testament prophets to describe it in great detail. And then I give many of the passages, and we could just pick and choose any one of these that describes the conditions during the millennial. But I just chose one I'd like to read in Isaiah 61. So if you want to turn to Isaiah 61, and we're just going to read that chapter. And one reason I chose this chapter is because it grabs hold of the first coming of Christ, but then it jumps to the second coming of Christ. And this is a passage that Jesus quoted in his first coming. Remember that sermon where he stood up to read, and he read these first two verses, and then he sat down and said, "Today this is fulfilled in your ears. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." And as we Bible teachers like to point out, he stopped there, didn't he? When he preached that sermon in the synagogue, he couldn't go on because anything after that is the second coming. And so he couldn't continue in that particular sermon, because then he could not say, "Today this is fulfilled." But everything up to and including to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, he could say it's fulfilled. The rest of it will be fulfilled at his second coming, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to console those who mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes. That's one of the wonderful phrases of the Bible. A lot about this life is ashes, isn't it? It's not worth anything but to burn up. Even many of our experiences we would describe as ashes, to be burned up and forgotten. But he's going to replace all of that with beauty. He's going to give the oil of joy to replace mourning. He's going to give the garment of praise to replace the spirit of heaviness. It'll be a wonderful time. That they may be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Then here's just some of the practical daily things that's going to take place in the millennial. They shall rebuild the old ruins. They shall raise up the former desolations. They shall repair the ruined cities. What will cities look like in the millennium? With the technology that Christ and his bride are able to recommend. How will cities operate? There'll be no energy problem. Ulterior kinds of alternate energy sources and things that we worry about today. There'll be none of that. People won't have to buy generators like everyone in Oklahoma and Texas have lately with the tornadoes. I read a little article today where people back in those states were arguing with each other about the best generator to buy. Depends on what size of house you have, depends on how many freezers or refrigerators you have, depends on, are you going to try to survive for just a few days or a few weeks? And they're all arguing about the different kinds of generators to buy. I've never bought a generator, so it's California. That's one of the good things about California. Generators are kind of down on your list. Some of those states, it's the most important piece of equipment you own. Anyway, verse 5, strangers shall stand and feed your flocks, And the sons of the foreigner shall be your plowmen and your vine dressers. But you shall be named the priests of the Lord. They shall call you the servants of our God. You shall eat the riches of the Gentiles, and in their glory you shall boast. Instead of your shame, you shall have double honor. Instead of confusion, they shall rejoice in their portion. Therefore, in their land, they shall possess double. Everlasting joy shall be theirs. That one statement's worth the whole thing, isn't it? For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery. For burnt offerings, I will direct their work in truth. I will make with them an everlasting covenant. Their descendants shall be known among the Gentiles, their offspring among the people. All who see them shall acknowledge them, that they are the posterity whom the Lord has blessed. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall be joyful in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself with ornaments, as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. For as the earth brings forth its bud, as the garden causes the things that are sown in it to spring forth, so the Lord God will cause righteousness and praise to spring forth before all the nations. And chapter 62 is the same thing. Got all kinds of these chapters in Isaiah and Ezekiel and Joel and Zechariah and Amos and other places. So it's kind of like the Lord didn't need John to write 5 more chapters about the conditions of the millennium. He just mentions it's going to be 1,000 years and it's going to be a great time. Go back into all the other places I already inspired that talk about it. You can find the details there. Finally, 2 whole chapters, chapter 21 and 22 of Revelation, describe the eternal bliss of the Lamb and his bride in a New Jerusalem. That is the prepared place that Jesus promised them in John 14, 1 through 3. I go to prepare a place for you. John now gets to see with his own eyes and deep emotions just how great that promise was when it was given so long before in John 14. Can you imagine what John thought? And I think in some way the Lord revealed to him that, come, I will show you the lamb, the bride, the lamb's wife. Took him up to a high mountain and he showed him the New Jerusalem. And I think in some way the Lord revealed to him, remember way back there when I said, I'm going to go prepare a place for you? And, you maybe had kind of in your mind a little bit of, yeah, it's probably going to be a nice place. Well, here it is. What do you think? Pretty nice place, isn't it? So what a great way for the mystery of godliness to close out the entire Bible with a description of where godliness will reign supreme. And of course, God's the one who will bring it about. Jesus secured it through his death and resurrection. And hopefully we'll get to be participants in that and enjoy the blessings of it. So we'll go ahead and close tonight's lesson and open it up for questions and discussions.